Wondering about that. Thank you, Adam. A lot of you, I think, attended the session they did a couple of months ago from my recently published The Jewish Family Ethics textbook, a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award 2021. Thank you very much. So I just want to say in one sentence that the method is to work on ethical problems by I create case studies that typify issues, right? I'll try not to move. Some of these are drawn from real life. Some of these are from the newspapers, ripped from the headlines, and others are sort of fiction that I wrote to try to describe cases that really come up that typify certain issues. So today we'll have a taste of one of the ever-present and really urgent issues, which is the ethics of abortion. Back in, it was late January or early February, there was this national Shabbat. It was Repro Shabbat, for reproductive rights Shabbat. And Rabbi David Catcherly was kind enough to call me and ask if I would teach from the book for that occasion, which I would desperately have loved to do. But he happened to find me at a moment when I was in Sacramento helping with our granddaughter. So I have no idea what he caught that day. So we'll see if there's any overlap. But you should know going in that one of the things that I'd like to stress in talking about Jewish ethics around abortion is that the tradition has thought about it very carefully for a very long time. And we're going to start with the rabbinic text that is probably earlier than the 3rd century of the Common Era. And yet it thinks about it completely outside the binary that we are accustomed to as Americans, or as North Americans, right? The pro-life, pro-choice binary is really not relevant to the way it's discussed. And I believe that the responses of the tradition are subtle, right? Are nuanced. That's a better word. Are nuanced, and it's not correct to say. I would suggest that either that the tradition is wholly supportive of abortion in all circumstances, nor to say that the tradition abhors the practice. So we'll try to show a little bit of that. And I'm going to work with you today on a case study that we can't possibly do it justice, but we'll at least make a start. And those of you who were here the previous time, I took a lot of grief that I very much earned for how much time I spent. So I'll try to watch the clock a little more carefully today. I'll try. That's all. I know on Shabbos, by the way, when I was U.S. Wire, we would go away for a Shabbaton. They used to do this thing where they took away our wristwatches. This was back when people had wristwatches, and they took away our wristwatches because like Shabbat should all be, you shouldn't be worrying about time. You should be steeped in Shabbat, which is an interesting practice to try sometimes. Okay. I didn't want to print out the case study, which is fairly long. I'm just going to summarize it for you verbally. This is a real one. This was actually a lengthy article in the Sunday New York Times Magazine in the summer of 2011. I was very grateful that I taught a unit on the ethics of abortion every year while I was teaching in Oakland High School. I don't know if Julian did this case or not, actually. But back in 2011, it's August, I'm just beginning to think about the new school year very reluctantly. And I open up the Sunday magazine, and there's this long article about this woman and her request to her doctors to perform a fetal reduction on her twin pregnancy. It's a completely new angle on abortion than I had known before. And I realized the New York Times wanted to give me some new material to teach, and I was extremely grateful for that. Okay, so here's the case. Woman named Jenny. She's in her early 40s, married. She and her husband have 2 children. And they decide, we're near the end of our fertile years. Let's have one more child. We'd like to have 3 children together. But she's already at an advanced maternal age, so she needs medical assistance with fertility. And it takes all the way to around her 45th birthday, and she conceives what turns out to be twins. And it's going fine, but she and her husband talk it over, and they feel very strongly that dealing with 2 infants and then raising 2 more children will be more than they can handle at their age. Right? They're not like 35, right? But starting at 45, they find that too daunting. They really, we wanted to have a 3rd child. That would be enough. So they learn, or they're aware that there's this procedure called fetal reduction. Now, fetal reduction essentially is when there's a multiple pregnancy that they can abort some of those embryos or fetuses, but not all. So it was developed mostly for kind of advanced multiple pregnancies like triplets, quadruplets, because that can be dangerous still today, or it can be dangerous both to the person carrying the pregnancy and potentially to the fetuses. Right? So if you have 4, if you reduce it, this is the medical language, if you reduce the pregnancy to 2, like twins is not so dangerous nowadays, thankfully, in most situations. That's what it was created for. It wasn't invented for, I have twins, and the doctors say that there's every indication that I can carry both babies safely to birth, but I just don't want to raise 2 children. And I know that Jenny and her husband, they also don't raise any economic arguments, right? They don't say, we can't afford to raise and educate 4 children. It's more than we feel we can handle. And the article is very interesting, where different doctors and the other medical professionals have different points of view about whether it's ethical to perform this reduction, so to reduce her from twins to a singleton. Okay, that's the case. So should Jenny's doctor agree to her request? That is the question in the case. Okay, so let's take a minute, because I always like in doing this, I think the first thing we should do is just look inside and ask ourselves, what are our instinctive responses, right? What do our intuitions tell us ethically before we study anything? So what do you think would be right? Yeah. I'm sorry.
From my perspective,
Yeah.
Don't do it.
Okay, it's not justified. Do you want to add one brief? It's not justified because, or just
It's not justified because, we have the economic needs, and they're deciding that, just one more kids, less than one kid, they can be able to it's not, it's not like buying a sick market.
okay, that's not a reason, right? It's not like deciding to take 2 things off the shelf for 1. That's not a reason to not allow this life to develop. Thank you.
Well, I'm a little concerned about the attitude that it expresses for the kids in general, like that it makes them understood to be somehow in an instrumental relationship to the parents, that they are there as kind of to fulfill the needs of the parent, the needs and desires of the parents, such that it would make me concerned that you to the well. Because that's not a very good relationship.
Thanks. I'm just repeating for people who might watch the YouTube later. Irene said that there's a certain instrumentalism in the way Jenny and her husband present this, that the children are for the parents, that kind of used rather than just for their own sake, in hearance sake. And, yeah.
You presented it as whether the doctor ethically performs. And I wondered if the question was whether the doctor could perform it ethically or whether it was ethical for the parents.
Well, we could go either way. Whether is it ethical for the parents or is it? Yeah. Okay. what's the difference between the questions?
I mean, I think that perhaps the doctor cannot include his own ethical views on that, if that is what the parents want. But I don't know.
Yeah.
And then for the parent point of view, I want to make some difference that these are the product of the intentional assisted fertility practice.
Right.
And not something that just happened at age. She found some accident at that age.
Oh, great. And note, it's very, very important for ethical analysis that this is a woman who desired very much to become pregnant and pursued what's probably, since it took a couple of years, I presume she pursued multiple rounds of IVF or whatever technique to get there. It's not like she, the expression like she fell pregnant, right? It just happened that she came up with twins. And also that perhaps there are slightly different ethical questions between the parents requesting this reduction versus the doctor agreeing or not agreeing to go along. Yes?
The procedure's not entirely discreet and could compromise.
And the procedure, and this is a medical point, right? The procedure is not without its own risks, and it could compromise the safety of the mother and possibly of the fetus, or what's intended to be the surviving fetus. Excellent. Okay, maybe one of the reactions that I did.
Well, it just seems like once you've conceded to the principle that someone can get an abortion because having a child would be just overwhelming to them, something they couldn't handle, then yes, it does confuse us that they want a child but don't want to be alone. But the same principle applies. Like, it is if abortion is allowed for the sake of someone not being able to handle it. So you could not be able to handle one kid, or it could be that you could say I'm not able to handle two kids. And it seems like, given that principle, like my inclination would be like, would put it.
Okay, if we concede that you have, but maybe beginning again, I'm sorry, like,
just if we concede that a justifiable reason for an abortion is I can't handle this, I won't be able to manage a child, then it's like by that logic, certainly you can say I can handle one child, but I couldn't handle two children.
So really, that's probably the essential question of the whole case study. What's a justifiable reason for an abortion? Is I can't handle that many children adequate? If it is, then it should go forward, and if not, then not. Okay, let's go to the text as it were. And as I said, think of this as just kind of a taste of the text study, because we would have to do about at least twice as much as this, right, to really justify, which is, forgive the commercial. It's another reason why you should just buy the book and read the whole chapter. But and you get a discount through eCar. But let me pass out these text sheets. Thank you. So it's not stapled together, but it is collated.
Oh,
Right, that's everyone should donate for eCar to have a better copy, and then they can be stapled.
We just ran out of staples.
It's like buy staples or payroll and that stuff. Okay, so what I'm doing here is I'm skipping over. Excuse me. We would usually start with some verses from Exodus that are the beginning of the whole discussion in Jewish circles about abortion, but I'm skipping that, and we're going to what I think is the key text to the entire subject, Jewishly, which is from the Mishnah. So that's what I was saying. The Mishnah is complete by around 220 CE, so this is probably even earlier than the 3rd century of our era. The Mishnah in the tractate Oholot describes this, and so I'm going to get people to read texts aloud, okay, and then we will discuss what they're saying. Okay, Adam, would you just read this one, please?
A woman who is having trouble giving birth, they cut up the fetus inside her and take it out limb by limb, because her life comes before its life. If most of it had come out already, they do not touch it, because we do not push off one life for another.
Thank you. Okay, very short and succinct Mishnah. Notice that there are two situations in the Mishnah, correct? Okay, and they're both, it begins, a woman who's having difficulty, I translated it, who's in trouble giving birth. And it means, and the commentators have no disagreement about this, it means that she's on the verge of death. Right? The labor is endangering her life. Okay, so what's the first scenario? And you'll forgive me how what's the word on this?
Graphic.
Graphic, thank you. How graphic the mission is, but this is also Roman era medicine, right? Okay, so they cut up the fetus inside her, remove it limb by limb. Very, very critical because her life comes before its life. Now, what changes in the second part of the Mishnah? Okay, for the rabbinical students present right in the Seifa, what changes? Just call it out somebody. Okay, the process of birth is further along. Most of it came out. So then we don't touch it. What's the rationale why we can't touch the fetus in that circumstance? I'm sorry? Baby now is a full life, and okay, we don't push off one life for another, so we just put our finger on something critical to the entire abortion debate in Judaism. The fetus inside the womb is not a life equal to the mother, to the woman carrying it, until, really difficult phrase, Yatsa Rubo, most of it came out. The majority of it came out. Why do I say that's such a difficult phrase? Does it strike you as difficult? Or is it only me? Yeah, why? How do we know 50% plus one of a baby emerging from the birth canal, right? What does that even mean? So there is another, we'll see actually in a moment. There's, because the mission began as oral tradition, we sometimes get different readings of it, and it's quoted in a different place in the Talmud as Yatsa Rosho, if its head is out. Okay, and that makes an intuitive kind of sense, right? Because the head, in a normal birth, the head of course comes out first. And having the head emerge does seem like a moment that might represent something. It could seem that way. Okay, but so we have the primary implication of the Mishnah is that an unborn fetus is not a life in the sense that the mother or any of us talking together today is a life. Oh, and notice also that in the case where the fetus now is a life and the mother is a life, the related principle is we don't push off one life for another. What does that mean? How'd you rephrase that?
You don't choose which one should live.
When you said you don't choose, we don't choose which one should live. We don't get to choose between one life and another life. And this has all kinds of implications in Jewish ethics, right? If you know some of the cases about like what if people are lost in the desert without enough water and blah blah blah. That's all related here, but I will not, for a change, I won't digress. Okay, questions about the Mishnah? David?
I've always been confused about this just on the medical level. Like as a statement of law or principle, it seems to say that full life begins at birth, and I get what's happening there. But like the situation where most of it has come out, but you would need to kill it to save the mother's life, is that a real medical? Like the idea that sometimes a birth is endangering a mother's life and you have to sacrifice the fetus, I get, but most of it is out and still you would need, like I just don't get the situation. I don't know if any doctors would, but.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you have any medical insight. My best answer is that it makes sense maybe for the medicine of Greco-Roman times. I don't know if it, in like a sterile hospital environment, maybe not so, but
right. Okay.
That's been my sense of it. Yeah, I mean, we think that they knew some kind of a C-section procedure, right? The rabbinic literature calls it Yotzei Dofen, coming out the back. But my sense is that women didn't survive that death. Yeah, that's all I know at that level.
Okay.
All right, so now, as I mentioned, this Mishnah is quoted in the Talmud in a different discussion in Sanhedrin. And what I want to show you now is two essentially responses or understandings of that Mishnah that create two approaches to Jewish ethics in the area of abortion. And from two major figures whose names you hear from our pulpit all the time. The first one is our man, Rashi, okay? That's an abbreviation for Rabbi Shlomo Yitzhak, right? Shlomo son of Yitzhak. He lived in what's now France, the area that's now France, in 1040 to 1105. For some reason, a piece of trivia that I memorized in rabbinical school is Rashi's dates, and I just say it every opportunity I get. Okay, so Rashi is explaining. So we're having this discussion over in Sanhedrin, and they quote this Mishnah to try to make an argument about a different situation. And so Rashi has to explain what's going on in that Mishnah. And there, this is where it's quoted as Yatsa Rosho, if its head came out in the second part of the Mishnah. And here's how Rashi explained it. Okay, who's my next reader? Thank you, Sam. Thank you. Okay, so see notice what Rashi is doing here, right? So he explains the second part pretty much the way we understood it, right? If its head came out already, it's as if it's born. That seems to be the moment of birth by the rabbinic definition. So we don't touch it to kill it. We don't do anything to harm it because now we can't choose one life over another life. But in the first situation, he explains it in a really interesting way that turns out to be significant. The whole time, it has not come out into the air of the world, right? So the fetus is still in the maternal body. It's not a nefesh. Now, this word, you may know this word, and you may have seen it in context where it means a soul, S-O-U-L. But in this part of rabbinic literature, it always means a living being. Nefesh means a living being. And it's very similar, it's very close, I think almost identical to the philosophic notion of a person. In philosophy, a person is a living being with intrinsic rights to life. Right? So, Adam, my brother-in-law, is a person. Yeah. He wasn't old enough, but when I first met him, but there are a lot of there are fascinating borderline cases, right? What about the person who's in a persistent vegetative state? Right? What about person born with these conditions where there's no real consciousness that we can recognize, and yet they breathe and have some biological markers. Okay, but that's not right. That's a different chapter. So the Rashi says the whole time it hasn't come into the other world, the fetus is in a nefesh. And only a nefesh has a right to life. And because of that phrase, this comment by Rashi becomes the basis for later writers in Jewish traditions who want to take a relatively expansive approach to abortion. Right? Those who want to permit in slightly more circumstances will cite this notion, right? Well, Rashi already said that if it's not in the air of the world, if it's in the body of the person carrying it, then it's not a nefesh. And in a nefesh doesn't have the presumption of a right to life that we have after birth. Questions, comments? does that have any implications to our case study? Okay, I mean, I see people are like, for sure, right? Okay, obviously, it's possible to point to this and say, well, Jenny's got two non-nefesh, beings going on there. So one of them could be sacrificed, right, for her interests. I don't say it's convincing. Right? I saw the reaction. I don't say it's convincing. I say it could be argued, perhaps. Now, lest you rethink that there's only a permissive approach, please turn the page over. You should see text 5b. So the Mishnah Torah, written, it's the code of halakha, Jewish law, written by probably the greatest Jewish mind of the entire more medieval period, Moses Maimonides, the Rambam. In his Mishnah Torah, in a section called Laws of Murder and Preservation of Life, he gives us this. Okay, who volunteers to read the first sentence? And then I will have to explain the concept. Thank you.
This indeed is one of the negatives. Not to take pity on the life of a
Road death. Pronounce it correctly. Road death. Okay, two things. We divide the mitzvot into negative and positive. Is that familiar for people, Hebrew fans? Mitzvot aseh, mitzvot lo ta'aseh. Negative mitzvot, which means don't do this. Okay, don't do this. So do not steal. It's not lo ta'aseh. So he counts among the negative mitzvot not to pity the life of a road death. Anybody know the meaning of that root in Hebrew, lirdof? Lirdof acharei. So pursued, running after. Very good. Rodef, it's the law of the pursuer. It's a specific law that the rabbis derived from the Torah. We have to kind of I have to kind of illustrate it. Okay, so suppose that Ivan and Wendy, can I use you? You guys, perfect. Okay, so suppose Wendy finally loses patience with Ivan after 50 years or whatever it is, right? God bless. Responsive is the same in French. Okay, so in 55 years, right? She finally says Diana, right? Okay, and she snaps. Okay, and we see Wendy running across the astroturf with a brandishing a knife, screaming, "This is it, Ivan, you're done. This time now you're done for." Okay. So Wendy is, in what I've just created, Wendy is the rebel. Right? Wendy's the pursuer. What's her intention? To kill Ivan. Okay. And the law of the Rodef is that any of us who has the opportunity must even kill Wendy to save Ivan's innocent life. That's the law of the Rodef. Yeah, you're welcome. That's the law. It's called the Din Rodef. Okay, that's the law of the Rodef. Did I explain something wrong?
No, I'm just feeling bad for Wendy and
that's fine. I always
they always seem so happy. And
I always ask permission to use people, and they don't know what's coming, but I got permission anyway. Okay, so that's the law of the Rodef. Okay, so watch what Rambam's going to do here. Okay, so we're not allowed to show pity, right? So we're not supposed to say like, oh, Wendy's so sweet, except for this one moment. Wendy's so kind and makes a beautiful tali toad, right? Like we're not allowed to do that. We have to save the innocent life. Effectively, they talk about it elsewhere. What's the penalty for premeditated murder in halakha? Can you guess? Yeah, it's execution, right? It's death. So effectively, Wendy has already sentenced herself to death, right? By showing she's going to take Ivan's innocent life. So we're just carrying out that penalty while saving the innocent life, right? So the halakha sees that as a win. Wendy, but right, that's what the law of the Rodef is. So now watch what Rambam now does to use it to interpret our mission on this basis. Okay, so Kathy, do you mind? Or?
On this basis, our sage rules that when implement has difficulty giving birth, it is permitted to force the fetus in the womb, whether by hand or with drugs.
Finish if you will.
It should not be touched. We do not push off one life or another. Every time, this is the nature of the world.
Thank you. Okay. So the last part is of course familiar, right? He's just repeating, right, that if the head has emerged, we don't touch it, we don't push aside or choose one life over the other. I mean, he does add the interesting phrase that this is the way of the world. In other words, I think he means we have to let nature take its course, right? And sometimes Rambam is 12th century, right? The Mishnah Torah came out in 1180. Sometimes labor is dangerous. And remember that Rambam was a medical doctor, whatever that meant in his era. That was how he made his living. Now, but the first part is the part that, while it's actually, if you look closely at it, it's a little hard to understand, but this is the way people understand it, right? That why did the rabbis allow aborting that fetus before the head emerges if it's threatening the life of the mother? Because they compared the fetus to what? To a rodent. Okay, so the way that this rule in Mishnah Torah is understood is we can abort if and only if the fetus could be compared by analogy to a rodent, only to save the life of the mother. So you can see then that Rambam becomes the father of Jewish thinkers who want to be restrictive about abortion rights. Those who want to say only danger to the mother's life or only serious danger, right, which different thinkers understand differently. Obviously. Yes, Charlie.
Quick question. I'm kind of confused. So before the head comes out, the baby should come out to save the mother. But once the head of the baby is out,
Right.
then you just let nature take over?
Correct. That's what he's saying. We don't intervene because we're not allowed to choose one life over another. That help? Great. Okay, so I wanted you to see these two, not because, and Wendy, I'll be right there, not because it resolves our case study necessarily, but this is the complexity that we find in the Jewish textual tradition, right? And people subsequently, people have grappled with the earlier opinions and also choose, and when you start reading later writers, and especially the 20th and 21st century writers, you start asking yourself, who are they emphasizing, right? And why are they choosing to emphasize that one? So we'll get to that. We're going to do some contemporaries as well. No peeking ahead. Okay, Wendy and Irene.
Is there a difference between when the head is delivered and when the fetus takes its first breath?
Yes, you will recall that when the head being delivered is well before the first breath. And even that Rashi is not at all about the fetus being able to breathe air. It's entering the air of the world, right? Entering the atmosphere of the world. So they are talking about that moment when the head is delivered and you have to like get ready for the next push to deliver the shoulders. That's what we're talking about. Is that answering what you're asking? Great. I mean,
What is the point of the road death? The road death has so why would it be
it's, well, I mean, the fetus is only opportunity to, first, you can't be a fetus unless you're in utero, so I don't quite get the premise, but you're right that one of the challenges to understanding Rambam's reasoning, and in fact the Talmud, in that where this discussion is drawn from in the Talmud, they completely reject the idea that a fetus could be considered a rodef, precisely because of the question of intent. You can't ascribe intent to a fetus. We don't know. As my brother, who's in MD, says that we still don't even have any idea of why labor begins when it begins. But there's still, I mean, by the way, he's not an OBGYN, so whether he's right about that, I can't swear. But that's still kind of a mysterious aspect of the human body. But you're right, and one legitimate criticism of this is to say that the analogy makes no sense. I mean, in the law there of death, it's someone who can choose that they want to murder someone, right? But he's careful to say, careful with that, right? Like the rabbis compared it. It's not exactly.
Well, and not only is it not exact analogy, but I read this and it exposes a sort of a contradiction in the internal logic of the discussion, which on the one hand says this is not a life, it's not a fully formed entity, and on the other hand ascribes the kind of intent and agency that presumes a fully formed living being. So there's something like you use the life idea when it works in one way, but you don't go there for other purposes. That's great.
It's a really good point. And if you want to go down a really complex rabbit hole, just read the commentaries on the Mishnah Torah on this, and your head will spin for several days. It's really I could always tell no one ever said I was actually nice. So when I taught this with 11th graders, a class that was they're perfectly intelligent, but nothing special. They just kind of take this at face value, right? Okay, Rambam says restrict to this, whatever. Really, really, really smart groups of kids would start challenging the premise, and they would notice the problem of intentionality that Irene just brought up, ascribing autonomy to a fetus, which doesn't make much sense to us, and so on. And the commentators notice it, and they do mental gymnastics around it as well. Yes, enough on that. Please.
I realized that we're discussing the life of the mother, that's being good. I'm assuming though that thing would apply if during pregnancy she died of cancer.
Yeah, almost. Well, that the problem is that the question there is that sometimes treating the cancer might end the fetal life. Yeah. So there. Okay. Yeah. So there, the question is about a woman who, after becoming pregnant, or I think sometimes it happens that as they discover the pregnancy and various tests are run, they discover some other potentially life-threatening condition that she has, and that usually is where the question of being a nefesh or not comes in. It turns out to be useful. In other words, we're often able to say in Jewish ethics that if we have to lose this fetus to save the pregnant person from this illness, that's our responsibility. That's actually our ethical responsibility to save what's actually the life from what isn't. Right. Using the Rashi and that mission. Yeah. Make sense? So okay, from here, I thought I'd show you some more or less contemporary sources. And those who were at the first session, you'll recall another important thing that we have to keep in mind in studying this kind of material is what the rabbis called machloket, which literally means disagreement, right? Dispute. But in my mind, it represents a whole style of arguing fiercely, really, while respecting the validity of there being different views, right? The different views can coexist. That's why we're finding so many different and often conflicting voices within Jewish tradition. Text 9 is, I brought you one sentence from a lengthy response that was written for the Conservative Movement's Committee on Jewish Law and Standards by the late Rabbi David Feldman. He was really one of the leading late 20th century experts on contraception and childbirth and abortion, that whole complex of issues in halakha. This was published in 1983, right? So relatively in the wake of Roe v. Wade in the U.S. And it's a long and interesting tshuva, which I have maybe 2 paragraphs in the book, and just one sentence I want us to look at. And unfortunately, we don't have the time or space to look at his supporting arguments. So he says the principle in Jewish law is Sa'ar Gufa Kadim, that the mother's welfare is primary. And he builds his tshuva on the notion that Sa'ar Gufa Kadim, we look at the mother's well-being. Over that matters more than the welfare of the fetus. Okay, so that, and in fact, actually, so what would be the obvious implication of that for Jenny, right, for Jenny's case? When you want to say it out loud, right, and then we would agree to her request for fetal reduction on the grounds that she's telling us about Sa'ar Gufa, right? She's telling us about her own potential suffering, right, and what she feels she can't bear. And it's interesting because Feldman goes through this whole thing. Like he says, suppose that there's you often have a pregnancy that is absolutely, it's going to go fine as a pregnancy, but testing shows that the child will be severely damaged in some way if they're born. And so he argues that if the parents come to the rabbi and say, we don't want the child to have to live with condition X or Y, that abortion should not be allowed, right? Because we're not allowed to decide what's a good or bad quality of life. But on the other hand, if they come to the rabbi and say, I feel that I can't live up to the pressures of raising a child with that disability, that he would permit. Okay, and he does, as I said, I wish I had time to teach it. When you invite me to teach you like 6 or 8 hours on the chapter 6 in the book, right? Like then we can go into this. But Feldman does have arguments in support of this view. A different contemporary one. This is also from somewhere in the middle 80s. J. David Blythe. He's still in this world at Yeshiva University, and he's an Orthodox expert on Jewish medical ethics. I believe he's the one who actually has advanced degree in some biological field. Like he understands the science and he understands the halakhic literature. And this is his view, his kind of general view of abortion and Jewish ethics. Anybody up to read the paragraph for us? All right. I know it's getting tired. So Blythe says this: the net effect of the ban against feticide. What is that word, by the way? I'm not sure if he invented it or not. See, what's homicide? It's killing a person, right? Homo is a man in Latin. So feticide, killing a fetus. Okay, so the net effect of the ban against feticide, or whatever grounds it is based, is to endow the unborn fetus with a right to life. Whether the unborn child is a, quote, person in the full sense, or simply a, quote, fetus, is irrelevant, insofar as the fetus's title to life is concerned. It is only when respect for the fetal right to life poses a threat to the mother that a question arises. Okay, what's he saying in 5 words? I didn't hear you. Yeah, he's saying forget about it, right? Don't talk to me about the differences of right to life, not right to life, whatever. Only if there is a severe threat to maternal survival could we even ask the question about having an abortion. Otherwise, forget it. There's nothing to discuss. Okay. Now, for some background, this is, by the way, that's pretty much the mainstream Orthodox Jewish view, to give it its due. Now, some background on this. Turn to the page, the next page, text 11. This is, by the way, these last 2 texts are written by women. I want to say, not to pat myself on the back or anything, but it was not easy to find women's voices to bring into this. in this chapter, and I really felt it was critical to do. So I was able to find a couple. So this Tirza Meacham is a scholar at the University of Toronto. This is an excerpt from the Encyclopedia of Jewish Women, which is available free online. It's a terrific resource. And she writes about, she surveys kind of the history of discussion of abortion in traditional Jewish circles. And she tells us the following. She says a couple really interesting things here. Okay, so can I have a reader to save some of my voice? Thank you.
At no point in the responsive literature of the 20th century is abortion considered.
Pause for a second right there. So responsa is those essays or letters that rabbis write when they're asked novel or hard questions in Jewish law. It's called a responsum, or plural responsa. So she says until the 20th century, no Jewish authority ever wrote that abortion was murder. She's right. Okay, so what happened? Go ahead.
There are definitely positions which allow abortion, even when the mother's life is not at stake. And weekend positions outnumber scripture.
Right. I've always wanted to ask her how she came up with that, like how she counted. But okay, let's take her word for it. Go on.
In the 20th century, the militant pro-life position with the Baptist Church and various fundamentalist Christian groups became a model for modern rabbinic positions.
And by rabbinic, she means Orthodox, to be clear. Okay. Let's go on and then we'll discuss.
One area of leniency involves IVF.
Mm-hmm.
Another area is multi-fetal pregnancy reduction, seen as a life-saving technique for the remaining fetuses. Doctors are allowed to decide which fetuses to save.
Thank you. So you notice that she addresses our case, at least indirectly. Professor Meacham. She addresses our case. Now, help me think about it for a second. Would Professor Meacham say that Jewish ethics support Jenny's request, or they don't?
But was Jenny's case IVF?
I believe that's how she became pregnant. Yeah,
But
but
when you do IVF, you're already putting multiple factors in there, so.
right. I mean,
so
you
there's
don't
a
know.
chance that they're all the same.
Right. I mean, you can. Okay, I don't know. I mean, I know because you don't know how many will plant and all of that, though. I know that it can be. I don't know the ins and outs, but I know our own children had an IVF procedure specifically so that my daughter-in-law had trouble carrying twins the first time around. So they did IVF specifically so she could have singles. So I don't know what all the ins and outs right now. You're right that often IVF is one of the reasons why there's a proliferation of twins and even more sometimes. I think what's interesting, I want to move us quickly toward the end of the discussion because I know it's getting late.
Can I just say before you move, this
Yeah.
is just a really, abortion aside, this is such a searing critique to say that like these positions are just being fashioned around like Christian fundamentalism. Like when someone takes a stringent position, it's often hard to argue with them because they're just being more religious than you are.
Right.
But if you say, actually, you're more religious, just like you borrowed from some other religious, that's a pretty threatening attack on the position and perhaps a really effective one.
I mean, you're really right, and she is her personal commitments are orthodox, right? She's not coming from a place of anti-traditionalism or something like that. But I think she makes as you say, like a really powerful sociological point, and it's true that the literature, the Orthodox literature, suddenly becomes a lot more restrictive, and she also. In parts that I haven't brought here, she relates it also to the reactions of the sexual revolution. Like the Orthodox rabbis feeling like people are becoming so inappropriate in their sexual behavior that we have to button it down even tighter. And I think there's a lot of truth to it, and it is if you read 18th and 19th century should vote on these matters, they are asking about the potential of abortion. They don't go, oh, that's murder. You know, I mean, they can't because like they've got Rashi, Rambam, or whatever in front of them. And it's true, yeah, they start to use some of the language that seems to be borrowed from the evangelical Christians. Yeah. Interesting. I wouldn't have known without this article. I wouldn't have known that the same stuff goes on in some parts of Europe as well. So, but what's interesting is that so she's sure that. I'm sorry. Did you want to say something? Meacham is confident that there's leniency for fetal reduction that we're talking about. But you notice that she says because it's seen as a life-saving technique for the remaining fetuses, which is, as I said, that's what it was developed for. And that's why the Jenny article, that is such a great ethical dilemma, because now we're not saying for the safety of the other fetuses, right, for the future of the other children, we're just saying for the welfare, if that's the right word, of the future mother and father, which is not quite that. One last one. Text 16, Rebecca Alpert, who was at one time was the dean of the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College. Very strong feminist voice in Jewish circles. Okay, I just like the way she put this. So, is there a volunteer reader? Thank you.
Jewish conversation about abortion is frequently morally. Let's not speak in limited language about the use of abortion as a sexual concern, nor avoid more complex discussions of sexuality. Let's not fail to examine the complexities of the need for abortion in society with many healthy children, and with little concern for how their children are cared for. We must not ignore the fact that children are still cared for predominantly by women, often for low wages and at the cost of their own education.
Thank you. So just that, I mean, this the contribution of this source, I think, is to remind us about what's often missing from our debate, even within Jewish circles, about abortion ethics. That is, the voices of those who traditionally are the ones who carry pregnancies and the consequences thereof, and the social implications, especially as I think she's right, given the realities of society that doesn't put much thought, let alone funding, into early childhood care compared to other advanced industrial societies. Though it may not say that much additional about how we should discuss Jenny's issue with her. And so, okay, let me pause for a second. Any comments that you've been holding, or any questions that's raised?
Well, do the guys who make the shift around 9 and 10, do they address the precedents of abortion? I mean, do they offer rationale for departing from the accepted law?
So what this is what I was implying before. The ones you're referring to, the Orthodox writers who want to be, they sorry, two things. First of all, they go to Rambam, right? And they say, okay, here's established halakhic precedent, right? The only issue to discuss is a threat to maternal life, right? And they don't always, Meacham kind of catches this, right? They don't always acknowledge what they're doing, and I think all halachas are like this. We sort of debate this in American judicial procedure too. It's like when you choose, everyone who makes decisions chooses what to emphasize, and they don't always spell out for you why they make these choices. And some choices are more conscious than others. I don't know. One of my It's interesting. One of my professors at JTS in a halakha course, he argued, he firmly believed that every rabbi who decides a halakha question knows in advance what they want to decide and finds the support that they need in the research. And I never knew whether that was like realistic or way too cynical. I mean, there are those who claim, if you come up with a really unprecedented question, then it can be argued that, like, well, I'm looking at new ways to apply the existing precedents. Here, okay, I'm meandering a little, so I'm going to stop myself. Yeah, often enough, people don't acknowledge their ulterior motives.
First of all, modern fertility methods are much less likely to produce twins that because the embryos are often frozen when there's an option to do them one at a time through cycles. Better practice these days not to do one. My daughter was not. So,
I have to do
anyway, but the other thing is that the majority of the who seek abortions already have children. And it's akin to fetal reduction. I mean, that they have chosen the life of the child they already have, knowing that they cannot adequately care for them. And this is very similar to the blood in utero. Two choose three one living child, 2 or 3 living children versus a fetus. And then you choose, you realize that you cannot save the life of your need to protect the lives of the child.
Thank you. I'm going to repeat that for the recording. Thank you very, very much. The point being made, look, we know that the majority of women who come for abortions in the United States already have children. And making a comparison to our case, which is women in such circumstances are choosing the lives of their existing children, right, and their ability to create that family life over the new fetus that has turned up. I really appreciate that because I had not thought about that in that possible comparison until you said it. Second edition. I'll give you. That is great. That is great. Good. I mean, I think that I've left you with kind of what I would like to leave you with some complicated things to think about. Right? I don't. It can be one of the challenges of Jewish ethics that it's often hard to reach just kind of clear, bright line answers. Right? And I always used to tell my students that the most we can do in real life is reach the best decision that we can make at the moment that we have to make that decision. Right? What's the most ethical decision I can make now? And if we reconsider it another time, that can happen too. That's one of the reasons that the multiple disagreeing voices are preserved in our tradition, so that we can rediscover them when we need them. Thank you. We'll be there. And,